Good morning, everybody, and welcome to GPE's webinar series. This is a series that was started in 2016, and we've had quite a full calendar throughout 2017 in a range of thematic areas. Today, it's no different. We're honing in our attention and our discussion on a very important topic, cross-cutting issue in the education sector, disability and inclusion. So I want to just start by thanking you all for joining today. And noting that this session is being live streamed on our YouTube channel in English and French. And so you should feel free during and after the event to share the links with your network on social media. There is a wonderful panel of experts today. I am not going to introduce them, but rather I'm going to introduce our moderator for today. Oh, I should stop and introduce myself. I'm Karen Mundy, and I'm the CTO at GPE. But I want to introduce our moderator. So with great pleasure, Connie Lauren Bowie will join us today as the moderator of our panel, and she will also introduce our other guests. Connie is the Executive Director of Inclusion International and the Catalyst for Inclusive Education Initiative of Inclusion International. Really happy to see other partners from all parts of the globe joining us this morning. So very much welcome and very much encourage you to participate in other seminars of this series. Is there any housekeeping points? Okay, sorry, I want to tell you give you a few technological guidelines. So first of all, please, can you keep your microphones on your phones and computers on mute to cut out background noises? If you have a connection issue, we have two monitors here who can help you. You can reach them by email at webinars@globalpartnership.org. And note that when you have questions, you can ask them via the webinar chat function as well as asking by email. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation, so any questions you send during the presentation will be reflected by the facilitators here in the Q&A session, and we'll also remind you of this session by sending you a link that you can share with others about a few weeks after the session. There is simultaneous translation in French and English, so again, make sure you're on the right channel to match your language need. So without any further ado, I want to welcome Connie. Nice to see you virtually, and we're really looking forward to this session. Thank you.
Connie, please unmute yourself.
Connie, we're not hearing you. You are on mute.
I was talking to myself. Good morning. Thank you very much for having us and for joining us on the GPE webinar. We have an interesting group of speakers today, 3 presentations for you that I think represent very different perspectives. One sort of overview that you will have about inclusive education from the GPE point of view from Ruchi. I'll introduce the presenters in just a moment. Also, we'll have perspectives from a government perspective with the Ministry of Education and also from a civil society perspective. So I'll give you a bit about the speakers in just a second. I think...
I'm sorry, it is impossible to hear. We have a lot of noise on the line.
Somebody's on the line. Sorry, somebody's on the line. We cannot hear you. Could you please remind them to turn off their mics? Thank you.
Umed, can you tell me when I should continue?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I assume the feedback's not coming from my line.
No, it's somebody else. Yeah, well, okay. Hopefully they will mute their microphone.
Okay. So I just wanted to, before
Sorry, we
introducing
still
you
can't,
to
we
the
cannot
panel-
hear anything. I'm sorry.
Uh,
I'm sorry, we cannot hear anything.
There
Connie,
is somebody on the line who's opened the mic, and we cannot hear anything. Sorry.
Connie, if I'm gonna mute everybody, please unmute yourself in a second, okay?
Okay.
Give me a second.
Yeah.
There's a chatter Nuruddin. It's unmuted. Which the colleague I think is that Comoros?
Achata? Okay. Achata is unmuted.
Achata,
I think we're good. I think we're good. I think the Comores, their mics was open, so I think
okay,
we
perfect. All right,
got it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Connie,
Okay.
please continue.
So, okay, it looks like my mic is unmuted. Umad, you can hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yes. So, okay, thank you. So just a quick contextual comment before we get to the presentations. I think that the GPE taking on the issue of inclusive education and disability is a critically important sign that disability is not a issue to be dealt with outside of our larger strategies on education. And so I really welcome the presentations and this opportunity to have a conversation about what it looks like at a country level, what the implications are globally. And just in a couple of sentences, in terms of the context and the normative framework for inclusive education, most of you will know and be aware of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Article 24 refers to inclusive education and lays out elements of what that looks like, including accommodation for children, but also it talks about the need for an inclusive approach across systems. This Sustainable Development Goal number 4 refers to inclusive quality education. And it's no accident that the SDG 4 refers to inclusion in the broadest sense, not specifically around disability, because after the Millennium Development Goals, we learned a few things about inclusion and who was being excluded, which children and why. As much as we were able to decrease the number of children out of school during the Millennium Development Goal period, we weren't successful in having any evidence that children with disabilities or other very marginalized children had increased the number of children participating. So it was, I think, an important turning point to have the SDG 4 adopted. Since that time, there has also been a general comment issued by the Committee of Experts for the CRPD. And the general comment really lays out what inclusive education means. It talks about what it doesn't mean, and it talks about what the implications of inclusive education mean. This conversation today, I think, is an important way to talk about our progress in including children, some of the strategies that are being used by governments and by international non-governmental organizations. I think it's an important conversation in the context of how do we look at education as a whole and make sure that children who've been most excluded have an opportunity to go to school, and that we organize our education systems in a way that are inclusive. So I'll stop there in terms of context. I think we do have a nice chunk of time for question and answer, and hopefully a conversation about some of these issues after the presentations. I'd like to introduce you to three presentations. I'll give a general introduction to the speakers now, and then as the speakers finish their presentations, I'll remind you who's up next. So there are three presentations and four speakers. The first presentation is Ms. Ruchi Singh. She's the Education Specialist in Disability and Inclusive Education for the Global Partnership on Education for Education. And Ruchi's going to talk to us about the stock take that GPA has done on inclusive education from a global perspective. The second presentation will be by Mr. Amroin Damkoy. Please forgive my pronunciation. The Inspector General of the National Education, Ministry of Education in the Comoros. The third presentation will be a combined presentation by Mr. Richard Matibu Musau, the Senior Technical Advisor for East Africa, Deaf World Child. Deaf Child Worldwide from Kenya. And then Ms. Catherine Muthoni Mwangi, the Education Program Manager for Voluntary Services Overseas in Kenya. So we have a nice geographic mix today. Thank you all for joining us at various times of day in where you are. Without any more delay, I'm going to turn this over to Ruchi Singh from the Global Partnership on Education to give you some perspective on what the GPE's stock take on disability and inclusive education found.
Thank you, Connie. I wanted to start today by not only giving a broad overview of the findings that that Global Partnership for Education undertook for assessing disability and inclusive education in the education sector plans, but I want to kind of take 2 minutes to really kind of lay down the context of why is it that children with disabilities matter. Next slide, please. We know that while the access to education has significantly improved globally in the past 15 years, nearly around 121 million children and adolescents are still out of school. Recently, it was estimated that out of around 65 million primary and lower secondary school-age children who have disabilities, nearly half of them are out of school, and this was specifically for the developing country context. Not too long ago, it was also estimated that around 90% of children with disabilities do not ever go to school at all, and out of the 10% who go, 5% barely complete primary education. And out of that pool of 5% who do complete primary schooling, girls with disabilities are even less likely to complete primary schooling than boys with disability. Next slide, please. Within that context, GPE's work within this area of disability and inclusive education is housed under the GPE Strategic Plan Goal Number 2. As some of you might know, GPE launched its strategic plan in 2016 and kind of... We will go ahead with the presentation, and once again, please ensure that your microphones are muted because it creates a lot of background noise for the interpreters to do their interpreting well. So moving on, just wanted to recap that the topic that we're talking about today, education for children with disabilities, is housed under the GPE Strategic Goal Number 2, which focuses on increasing equity and gender equality and inclusion for the poorest and the most marginalized, including children with disabilities. Next slide, please. So just to give a brief on what the stocktake on disability was all about. The purpose of the stocktake was really to kind of understand the commitments as well as the patterns of engagement and basically the strategy that countries are employing towards education for children with disabilities as articulated in their national education sector plans. We did that by reviewing 51 of the national education sector plans for GPE's developing partner countries. And the information that was reviewed was from, like I said, the national education sector plans as well as the program implementation grants which GPE grants out. Before I kind of deep dive into the findings, of the stock take, I wanted to kind of give a signposting of what the presentation is going to be like. I'm going to first talk about the overall status of the 51 countries, then deep dive into what is it that the governments are planning for in terms of quality of education, quality of teaching, and access to learning. And then we're going to talk about some of the gaps as well as opportunities that are available as we move forward in this very important area of work. Next slide, please. So this slide gives a basic overall picture of the status of GPE's 51 developing country partners, which were a part of the sample group. Around 24 sector plans out of the 51 that were reviewed have some sort of an articulated strategy, and which means that these countries are planning for improving data, some kind of access, quality of education for children and disabilities, as well as putting some money aside, budgeting for such activities, as well as monitoring the progress of their work. There are around 19 countries which are beginning to consider disability and inclusive education in their education sector plans, and 8 plans do not mention children with disabilities at all. It is important to flag off here that it was observed that the sector planning around education for just children with disabilities is often varied in strategy and the approach that the countries follow. And this planning and the strategy is very much based on the context and the information that is available to the countries, which often isn't a lot or which is often not very robust as well. Next slide, please. This slide basically gives an overview of, the responsiveness of education sector plans with respect to children with disabilities by region. I must say here that the sample is dominated by the West Africa and the East African countries because they form a bulk of the sample. 35 countries out of the 51 were a part of this particular region. But just it gives a big overall picture of which regions are concentrating on what kind of strategies. Next slide.
Somebody's on the line. Could you please ask them to turn off their mic? Thank you.
Can I request all participants to please turn off their mic? Is it okay now?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Okay. So I quickly wanted to really give a flavor of within our stock take, what is it that the governments are planning for? What is it that they are investing in? And it was interesting to note that around 13 countries in the review are in the process of either drafting a policy on inclusive education or are developing one. We know that the policies give a clear direction and vision towards inclusive education, and which hopefully will be
I'm
followed.
sorry, we still...
I think we're back, and thank you so much for being with us. We've sorted the technical issue, and apologies for the same. Hopefully, we should have the next, an hour of presentations and discussions without any technical issues. So I will move on. If you can change the slides, that would be great. Next slide, please. And the one after that. And the one after that. And another one. All right. I think we were on the slide where I was sharing that from the stock take, what is it that the governments are highlighting and are planning for? I think it's important to mention that, like I said before, that planning is itself quite varied in its strategies and its approaches which are being followed. Implementation of inclusive education is majorly at a very, very small scale. Most of the countries are looking at pilot projects which kind of run across 2 to 3 districts, or even as small as one district. There are few large-scale inclusive education projects, but those are very, very few. It is important to flag that there is also expansion of special education as well as construction of special schools. But what was evident from the stocktake was that most of the countries are integrating children in regular schools, children with mild disabilities, which can be integrated without much support or accommodation. But the children with high support needs, children with profound disabilities and high learning needs are often placed in special schools. Next slide, please. In terms of investments, there is a lot of focus on school access. It is mostly articulated in the form of construction and design for accessibility. Around 21 education sector plans specifically prioritize infrastructure and construction of ramps in schools. However, transport, which we know is one of the major barriers why children with disabilities are unable to access schooling, is just highlighted or prioritized by one education sector plan. There are investments in terms of capacity building for teachers in form of in-service teacher training, as well as identification and screening of disabilities. There's some focus on procurement of teaching and learning material. Encouragingly, disability data has started to be flagged as an important area of work by 10 education sector plans, and screening and identification and connecting them to larger support services is also what the governments are broadly planning for. Next slide, please. I will now go into a little bit of deep dive into the analysis of what the findings were and what were we able to draw out of this. And I wanted to kind of say that this analysis was done basis 3 dimensions in terms of how are the sector plans addressing learning outcomes for children with disabilities, how are they responding to equity and inclusion, equity issues, and how are they also strengthening effective and efficient education systems when it comes to education for children with disabilities. Next slide, please. In terms of quality learning, important things to flag off is that teacher training activities, like I said, in form of pre-service and in-service training, is the most commonly planned intervention, and this is followed up by this is not really closely followed up by in-classroom support, which is available to teachers. Next slide, please. Here here you can see that it's very evident that the graph is top heavy in terms of when it comes to providing services in terms of teacher training and teaching and learning materials, which are one-time investments. Those are pretty common and pretty popular. But if you look at the bottom of the pyramid, which really talks about what is the mechanisms of support which will be required by a teacher to continuously provide support and to address diversity in learning continuously, are seldomly planned by education sector, seldomly planned in the education sector. Things like recruitment of additional staff or providing support to teachers is not planned enough, and that needs to be addressed perhaps more concretely. Next slide, please. In terms of addressing quality of learning, one of the biggest things that we were able to find in the stock take was that the data with respect to learning outcomes is just not available in the education sector plan. So no education sector plan is talking about learning outcomes or an articulation of how learning outcomes need to be considered. There is some talk about adaptation of assessment to basis the learning style of children. But there are not too many details around this to concretely say what does that really mean. There are 6 countries which plan to align assessment methodologies with the student learning style. Adapting curriculum is one of the most highlighted strategy in the area of quality of learning, but again, there are not too many details around this. And toolkits, guidances are toolkits, and is another important intervention strategy. Next slide, please. Again, in this pyramid, one again finds that the top is heavy in terms of developing or modifying curriculum. Countries are planning for that, but again, the mechanisms which are required for the teacher and the students are kind of lean. Planning for toolkits, resource centers, and measuring learning and participation are not given that much importance, and the focus is on modifying curriculum without much consideration of the resource support which will be required to implement that modified curriculum in the classrooms to address diversity. Next slide, please. Quickly wanted to go into what are the plans doing in terms of addressing equity and access and education systems. In terms of equity, the recognition of the double disadvantage that the girls with disabilities face is very minimal. Only 4 countries look at targeted enrollment for girls, and there is a rather interesting focus on incentivization, which is in forms of scholarships for girls and boys. And these incentivizations are often given depending on the degree of disability. And the scholarships are also mostly for medical and rehabilitation expenses, mobility aids or appliances, but seldomly target education or a provision of school transport or learning material or books, which can really help children with disabilities really kind of access learning and go forward. Next slide, please. In terms of improving school access, I think I mentioned before that this is one of the most important areas highlighted by the education sector plans. Around 40 countries highlight increasing access as a strategic priority. And again, the focus is mostly on building school accessibility, but the focus is also on providing special schools and expansion of special schools. In terms of regional focus, it was interesting to note that the West Africa region, the focus is as much on construction of accessible schools as it is on construction of special schools. In Central Asia, the focus for improving access goes in terms of promoting deinstitutionalization to promote mainstreaming. And all across the regions, attitude barriers are highlighted as a key challenge, and hence there is a strong focus on awareness-raising activities. Next slide, please. In terms of some of the countries, encouragingly, are planning to improve data collection. A total of 10 countries plan to improve data by use of either censuses or EMISes. But it was interesting to note that out of 51 countries which were present in the review, 29 included data on children with disabilities in the education sector plans. We know that there is an issue with data is a huge issue in with respect to disabled children, because the data often varies in the methods of data collection, reporting, as well as forms of data used. Hence, it was extremely difficult to draw any kind of conclusions or do any kind of comparative analysis between the countries as well. Next slide, please. I think it's important to kind of now reflect that now that I've talked about what is it that the countries are really governments are planning for, and the patterns in which the governments are planning, it's important to really think about what is it that the education sector plans were articulating as the barriers which the countries face when it comes to planning for education for children with disabilities. And this slide basically gives a breakdown of the demand and the supply side barriers, which many of us are very, very familiar with. And the names of the countries just give a flavor of what is the key challenges that each of these countries think that they are facing, and hence kind of guides the planning and the intervention response that they are articulating in the sector plans. Next slide, please. I just wanted to close with two slides of really giving all of you an understanding of what are the key gaps which were highlighted during the exercise. We know that there is a clarity on the policy approaches, or the implementation approaches is kind of not holistic. That is something that we need to plan better. We need to think about those things in a better way. We know that limited data is on the total number of children with disabilities, proportion enrolled in schools and out of schools, the type of schools children with disabilities are accessing is not there. So data in terms of type, quality, and disaggregation is extremely limited, and that's a huge gap. Financing and budgeting, there is limited information on that. Either there is no information, or if there is information, it is very, very weak. The sector plans, the implementation activities within the sector plans are not costed well, and the budgets are not very well aligned. We were also not able to understand how the activities were being planned, because the countries which are not funded by GPE and other development agencies, the information was not reflected in the sector plans. Monitoring and evaluation indicators are to make tracking progress and achievement easy is something that's not there, and that's a huge gap. And also within sector plans, the ESPs are limited in exploring the partnership with parent organizations, the community, as well as the civil society. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to leave the group with some of the points for reflection, which are basically two forward-looking thoughts. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about is that we know that we need to bridge the data gap. We know that better data leads to better sector analysis and better sector planning. And we need to kind of really consider how is it that we can do that. GPE, with its partners like UNICEF, is working on developing a chapter in the methodological guidelines on inclusive education, so that the sector analysis can be done with a lens of inclusion. We need to also look into the cost-benefit analysis of special schools versus inclusive education, schools which provide mainstreaming, and really build a case for inclusion. And perhaps the sector analysis can help us do that. We need to start bridging the data gap by collecting more and better data. Inclusive EMISs, the child functioning modules, and the Washington Group's questions, 6 questions on measuring disability, can provide a huge opportunity to really look at collecting better data. And then there's also the sector planning guidance, which GPE is developing internally, which will help countries to develop better sector planning, which is inclusive and looks at different equity issues. And one of the last things that I want to really say is that perhaps we really need to also look into how do we measure learning outcomes with children with disabilities. This is a larger issue for much debate and much discussion, but it's an important one because we know that inclusion is directly linked to, access, but also towards participation and learning, which makes inclusion possible. I will stop there and thank you so much for listening and to really being so kind and patient with the challenges that we've had today. Thank you.
Ruchi, thank you so much. And thank you to the participants for sticking with us. I think it was worth getting through the technical glitches to be able to hear that analysis. I think, Ruchi, the presentation is full of a lot of discussion points. I hope that we will still be able to get to some of those after the other presentations. I want to just check with you, the organizers, do we still have our colleagues from Comoros connected?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will move directly into the next presentation and introduce to you Mr. Amaroy Darkeo. I apologize again for my pronunciation. The Inspector General of the National Education Ministry in the Union of Comoros. Merci, monsieur. À vous.
Interpreters, would you please...
Yes, we did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We seem to have a little bit of a problem with the line right now.
Connie, I would suggest to
switch presenters?
Yes, because
okay.
It seems like colleagues from Nairobi, they're ready. So
okay.
We will move.
Excellent.
Yeah, we will move forward with their presentation.
So a little change in the agenda. We are going to ask our colleagues from Kenya to present next, and we'll try, I think, to get our colleagues from Comoros back on the line. Just to give you a quick introduction, from Kenya we have Mr. Richard Mativu Museo, the Senior Technical Advisor East Africa for Deaf Child Worldwide Kenya, and Ms. Catherine Mutoni Mwangi, the Education Program Manager from the Voluntary Services Overseas in Kenya. And they're going to give us a presentation about some of the work that they've done for deaf children in Kenya in education, and I will hand it over to them. Thank you for jumping in.
It's okay, you're welcome. Hello everyone.
You're good, we can hear you.
Okay. Hello everyone. We are presenting, and our presentation is on looking beyond the curriculum reforms. progress and challenges in the education for deaf children in Kenya. So I need to remind you that when we say deaf children, we mean all children with hearing loss. Whether they use hearing aids, cochlear implant, speech, whether sign language, they are all deaf children. Please move to the next slide. Our presentation will cover 4 key areas. I will go through each. Please allow me to continue. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. On this slide, we want to talk about, you will notice that our main focus will be on Kenya's sign language. We have other communication methods for deaf children in Kenya. But for now, broadly, I'll talk about Kenya's sign language because it is used more because of the context. Things like hearing aids, they're expensive. Cochlear implants, they're expensive. The services, they're not available in a local context. And they are mostly used in the schools for the deaf. In 2010, Kenya promulgated a new constitution. And this constitution recognizes sign language. It recognizes sign language. Sign language was the third mentioned language in the constitution. This made sign language a right for deaf children. It gave sign language a big weight. From this year, that is 2017, we have the curriculum reforms. And in these reforms, sign language has been recognized as a language of instructions in schools for the deaf. And also, it can be taught in a mainstream school for the hearing as a language. Same level as French, Spanish. We need to know that overcoming language barrier for the deaf children is a huge challenge, and a lot of focus and energy should be there. Why? Because deaf children, they are unlike hearing children, they access language very late. Learning is hard for them. Over 90% of deaf children, they are born to hearing parents. They struggle with sign language, to acquire language, because even the parents have nowhere to learn sign language. So the deaf, they miss to learn the sign language early. And remember, it's a fact that if a child misses to learn language before the age of 4 years, the child will struggle all through his life acquiring the language. We will also be talking about the 3 models applicable in Kenya. We have integrated units with deaf children. We also have residential schools for the deaf, and we also have inclusive education. All are applicable in our context. Please move to the next slide, please. This table, as you can see, it shows the comparison of the curriculums, that is before and after. Now the current curriculum is there. The theory is seen to be very positive in theory. It is more beneficial to learners with disabilities. It recognizes sign language. Before, sign language was there, but it was not recognized by the curriculum. But right now, it is more weighty. The new curriculum is flexible. It focuses on learning and competence Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay. This table, we got it from Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development. From this table, you can see where they started to do functional assessment. Before they come for the functional assessment, and they go first to educational assessment resource centers. The children will be identified from maybe clinics or other facilities for early years. For example, in Kenya, when you take your child to the clinic, maybe for vaccines, the doctor will screen your child for any developmental challenge. If they find any, they'll refer to either a medical attention or educational placement. Depends with the age of the child. Now, for education, children are referred to educational assessment resource centers. Now, from there, they will be assessed depending with their disability, and they'll be making a referral to the best institution for the child. So, from this table, you can also see the new curriculum recognizes many disabilities. Previously, in the previous curriculum, it recognized the traditional disabilities, that is, children with blindness, deaf children, children with physical disabilities, and those with intellectual disabilities. From the same curriculum, you can also see some terms which are used, like handicapped and impairment. Those are not terms that Deaf Child Worldwide or Voluntary Services Overseas use. And at the same time, I want to say that Deaf Child Worldwide, from our experience, we know very well that deaf children can perform effectively the same way, just like an average hearing child, using the same curriculum with few adaptations. Deafness is not a learning disability, meaning they do not need a special curriculum. Please, let's move to the next slide. This just shows that we had the pilot this year, May to June. What we got from here was that the pilot was a big success, but a lot remains to be done. More on implementation. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. Now, this slide, the messages that I want you to pick from here. First are the challenges, the early access to language. Previously, I talked about deaf children struggling to learn language from early years. So, this is a big challenge. Why? Because many deaf children, when they go to school, their language is not the age-appropriate language. So many teachers, they have to struggle teaching the deaf child a language before they start with the syllabus, which means that they will delay on covering the syllabus. That's a big challenge. The next step, on knowledge and skills, a big gap, because most teachers, maybe they have done special needs education, but they cannot sign very well. They are not fluent in sign language. Other teachers, they've never stepped in a college on special needs education. And also some teachers, they do not know how to teach deaf children. they do not know how to develop deaf-friendly teaching aids. For example, you can go to a school for the deaf, then you look at the wall, it's just empty. It's plain. They're just plain, without any material. Remember, deaf children, they learn visually. They use their eyes. So a lot of visual aids are important. Please, let's move to the next slide. The next slide. Thank you. This slide, it shows 3 pillars. First, it talks about community empowerment for deaf inclusion model. This is a project that is anchored on Kenya National Education Sector Plan, Vision 2030, and also in Sustainable Development Goal number 4. Community empowerment for deaf inclusion, this is implemented by voluntary services overseas and supported by Deaf Child Worldwide. It is implemented in 4 counties in Kenya. Previously, in the previous slide, I talked about some challenges. Now, in this slide, this project we have handled. We are continuing to handle some of those challenges. This project is running for 3 years now and handling some challenges that I mentioned previously. From the first pillar, you can see on early intervention, the project has established additional resource units in each of the schools that we're working in. This unit, the children come to those units and they do a focused learning. The teachers practice individual education plan with the children. The same place, parents come on specific times to learn sign language, on how to communicate with the child and also support their children. The next pillar on skills. Voluntary Services Overseas has worked with Kenya Institute of Special Education, where they came up with a specialized course for teachers on deaf education, specific and on the needs identified from the teachers, working in collaboration with the teachers to identify the gaps, and came up with a course on those gaps. This course so far, we've trained over 200 teachers. Teachers are very happy. Once they go back to the schools and work from the classroom and also the additional resource center. We also submitted a memo to the Ministry of Education on this. The new task group working on the curriculum reforms. Move to the next slide, please. Move to the next slide, please. On recommendation, broadly, we are recommending that we need to help deaf children learn the language from early years. In schools, we need to work with deaf role models to help deaf children learn the language. We need to invest more on quality teachers training. We also need people to support teachers. Move to the next slide. Continue to the next slide. On curriculum. No, previously, the previous slide. Yes, thank you. Currently, sign language has limited vocabulary. We need to do research and identify more vocabulary on sign language. It is limiting. It's subject-related vocabulary. We also must work with the government as collaborators, as partners, as opposed to just playing an oversight role. Please move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay. Our final slide. On this, it's on research. Deaf Child Worldwide and Voluntary Services Overseas, they are working together. Next year, January, February, we will be conducting a research on early years ECD, early education, ECDE, early childhood education, development education. This is where we will be developing some language assessment tools. We will also be assessing children from early years on how they acquire language, challenges they face with limited language. And we hope to find a lot, and we will learn a lot from this research. And we will share widely, with the recommendation widely. Finally, moving to the next slide. Thank you. Finally, as you can see, the two organizations. Please, you can visit our website. You can learn more about our work, and also visit our Twitter handle and learn more about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the presenters. That was an excellent overview of both the changes in Kenya at the government level in terms of recognizing sign language, which is an amazing development and something I think worth discussing in more detail across the GPE countries. Also, the presentation more specifically on the work that two NGOs are doing in Kenya. I think emphasizing that so much innovation comes out of the NGO community working with government, and it does raise a number of it does raise a number of questions about how we facilitate that. I'm going to ask my colleagues in Washington whether we now have our colleagues in Comoros back on the line.
Yes, we do have them connected, but in the meantime, I would like to encourage our viewers to post their questions on YouTube through the chat room, YouTube chat room function. And
okay.
And now we will try to have our colleagues from Comoros to deliver their presentations.
Okay, so very briefly, because we are running late, but now at least our technology is working, so let's make sure we get through the final presentation. Monsieur Amaron Darcayo, the Inspector General of the National Education Ministry for the Union of Comoros. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, go ahead. So this is a very quick presentation of the country. So as you know, the Comoros are composed of four islands, Mawali, Mzwani, and Mayotte is still part of the French administration. So we're going to talk only about the three islands that so we have 96% of children in school. Next slide, please. Okay. The situation here is what we're going to do is we're going to do an overview. what we have is at first a survey regarding the situation of persons with disability that was done in January 2003, and that prepared the third general census of the population as well as housing. And from that, we were able to actually undergo and undertake the following actions. Next slide, please. Okay, specifically, the opportunity for schooling. There was a regional study that was undertaken for Eastern and Southern Africa, and we basically looked at the knowledge of the laws and policies, the definition and identification of disabilities, and we also did surveys in 2016 and 17 in the schools, whether it was at the pre-primary school or the primary school. And it showed that in terms of public and private institutions, it showed the number of children who were in school. So it was 315 in the pre-primary school with CWD, and 1607 in the primary school. Next slide. Within that context, this is the strategic and policy framework that was set up for the CWDs based on the surveys. The interim education plan from 2013-2016, then the accelerated growth and sustainable development strategy, SCAD-2D from 2015-19, then the UNICEF country program document from 2015-19, then the transitional education plan, which is actually being set up right now and launched, and then the National Basic Education Strategy for Children with Disabilities, as well as the Basic Education Action Plan derived from that, and that will go from 2017 to 2026. Next slide. So in terms of the interim education plan, this plan was implemented, and it was supposed to go from 2013 to 2015 and was extended to 2018. On this basis, the activities relate to the extension of access to children with disabilities, awareness campaigns, and so that these children could be taken care of, the development of a database, and the care of 160 children who were visually and hearing impaired, and the training for Braille and sign language, as well as the improvement of access facilities and accommodation in school for children with handicaps. So that is what was planned. Next slide. Next slide.
No. As to the implementation, we had an awareness-making campaign. The database was established that were inserted in the general statistics. And we have access ramps in 88 classrooms, household surveys, guidance for health personnel and trainers, for the support of children, a national strategy for children, and an action plan that for schooling, and then the prioritization of the strategy to provide support to mildly hearing impaired children. Next slide. Within these actions, we have specific activities that are supported by the GPA and UNICEF for the education of CWDs, support to schools for these children, support for the children that are enrolled, surveys and studies, and manifestly a national strategy and a plan of action that were supported within this framework. Next. Now, for the strategy for accelerated growth and sustainable development 2015-2019, within this framework, we anticipate the national solidarity and social protection, but also a medium-term development policy, and then the improvement of access to health and nutrition services. This is mainly for handicapped children, and that's for all people, for children that go to school. Next. Now, for the transitional education plan, 2017-2020, we're looking at equity and inequality. But we're also talking about cross-cutting aspects of educational development. So mainly, the education should be inclusive, and then we're talking about access, retention in quality education, both, well, mainly in the primary education sector. Next. Now, these were the main orientations. Now, specifically for the primary level, access and equity at the primary level, stimulation, improved access, awareness raising to encourage families to send their children to school, expansion of free primary education, and then incentives to enroll children excluded from schools. We also have inclusive education for children excluded from primary education. We should stimulate demand. We should have a program to build access ramps, but also a partnership to be implemented between the education offices and the NGOs that are specialized for children to provide children with disabilities with adequate materials. Next. The national strategy for children with disabilities will be the following. It's been implemented for 2017-2026. It's based on 8 strategic priorities: awareness raising and involvement of communities, training of personnel providing support, transformation of the school environment, piloting of inclusive and specialized education, the institutional framework and management, production of statistical data on these children, partnership for the enrollment of children with disabilities, and then financing inclusive education. Next. Regarding the Basic Education Action Plan for Children with Disabilities, it is based on a strategy. And we are underlining first the prep phase that will give assistance and support in the current situation. We have about 300 schools, both public and private, that support children with disabilities. So we will support these schools, but we will also identify other schools that will support children. 6 of them 2 per island, 1 in urban areas, the other in rural areas, and then we will assess their capacities. Then we'll have an experiment with innovative education for children, but the other schools will also be informed, and the education for children will be pursued. And then the third phase will be the extension of this experiment to all schools in our country. Next. And now, out of this, we have the strengths that were identified. We have a political will and diverse initiatives of education stakeholders and of civil society organizations, ratifying several conventions, the adoption of an enactment of the law on the promotion and protection of the rights of people with disabilities, then the existence of a number of laws regarding these rights and protection, education, inclusion in the education in all sectoral plans, initiatives adopted by school principals and teachers to enroll CWDs, the existence of a CSO network working to support and ensure the social inclusion of people with disabilities that were already supported. So we already have that will in place. Then we have a system that has acquired sufficient capacity to accommodate all primary school age children. In 2015, we had 1,100 pupils with disabilities. In 2016-17, we now have 1,600, so which means that we saw a rise in enrollment. We have a few weaknesses, though. At the institutional level, the absence of a national inclusive education policy, but we're implementing it based on the strategy and the action plan. We have very few social workers, a lack of expertise to identify parameters for accommodating children, no training programs for teachers, and then lack of services for children within the education system, but also not enough data, lack of materials for teaching, lack of the education system for supervising, and then lack of facilities and living spaces. Now, on the demand side, the main issue is the negative societal perception of disabilities in a general way within society, and a high dropout rate that is quite high with children living with disabilities, then the environment, unsuitable physical environment in schools, lack of adaptation, and then inadequate awareness with the relevant stakeholders. These are the weaknesses. Next. Now, we still think that the opportunities are present, and we are optimistic because the next GPE program will help mobilize additional funds for CWDs. We have revisions underway to anchor the issue in strategic and institutional priorities and guidelines. This helps direct all education activities towards the implementation of a national strategy and action plan that was developed for this. We have to build everything in the strategic areas that were developed for 2017-2026, and then we have determined immediate actions that should be planned. First, Volunteer teachers and teacher trainees will receive 3 months training in sign language and Braille. Children will be supported in pre-primary schools and in the first 2 years of primary school. Then classes will be specifically dedicated in some primary schools, and children will then be mainstreamed in regular schools in the 3rd year of primary school, and then will purchase specialized equipment. These were the perspectives that will be implementing soon. Next. Based on awareness raising, we have these posters that were posted to mobilize all stakeholders. This is to listen to children, to have stimulation and awareness raising on children, inclusion of children, and then all stakeholders, be they institutional or civil society, should be aware of this issue. Next. And these are our words of thanks for your attention. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It gives us a very good specific example of the work at a country level that the government of Comoros is doing to include children with disabilities. I have to apologize that I'm going to have to leave. We had planned a question and answer, and I believe that my colleagues...
I'm sorry, we cannot hear you. One of the mics is still on. There we go. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to the all of the presenters. I think there was many different parts of the presentations that would be worth pursuing and discussing. There's quite a lot of information and technical conversation to be had. I will make one general comment before I have to leave you, unfortunately. I believe, Ruchi, you will still be fielding some discussion with the participants?
Yes.
Okay. So just before we open it up for question and answer, I think we have a couple of those online. I just want to say, first of all, thank you again to all of the presenters. I think that what the presentations have really struck me a couple of things. One is that we all use very different language to refer to inclusion. There's very clear, I think we now have very clear guidance on what the normative language on inclusive education is. I think there's a lot of use of terminology like integration and inclusion, and very often we mean very different things in using those terminology, and I think we need to begin to be much more disciplined about what it is we think inclusive education is. I think there's an established guidelines for that from the general comment of the Committee of Experts. The other thing, though, I think that the presentations really underline is, even though there's been increased attention to the need for inclusion of children with disabilities, there's very different levels of knowledge about how to make inclusion possible. And the natural inclination seems to be to focus on disability and accommodation. It isn't necessarily being taken up in the larger education strategy reform. So those are my general thoughts, just listening to the various presenters. It is impressive how much work is going into thinking about inclusion and how we do a better job globally of making sure that children with disabilities are not left behind. Richie, although I think some of the questions will be targeted at you, I apologize again just because of the delay in the webinar. I do have to run right now, and if it's okay, I'll let you take it from here. And it looks like you still have some good numbers of participants wanting to have a conversation. So thank you for including me, and please continue on.
Thank you so much, Connie. And I just wanted to thank each and every one of you, and a special big thanks to our presenters who've joined all the way from Kenya and Comoros, and also thank you for bearing with us while the technical issues delayed the presentation. So thank you. We have a few questions, and I would encourage the participants who are still online on live chat to type some of their questions if they have any. There's one question regarding that the list of countries which were there in the stocktake in the review. The stocktake will be available as a published public document report. You could expect this report anytime in the new year, and you will be able to see a detailed analysis of the countries in the stocktake. Unfortunately, during the presentation, it was very difficult to kind of really show, this division of data country by country. We would have liked to, but that wasn't possible. That's why the presentation kind of focused on, larger numbers and larger, how many countries did that and how many countries responded to that. So question well received, and do watch out for that space for sure. Do we have any questions in French?
We do, but I'll ask the questions in English. There's a question from Hisimo Diallo. Does GPE support the implementation of inclusive education actions outside the sector plan? And then again from Monsieur Diallo, what is the position of GPE on the development of inclusive education through non-special schools, or the development of specialised schools which fall under the ministry or the family?
All right, so I'm going to take the question on the support from GPE outside the sector planning on activities. GPE supports countries via the National Education Sector Plan through the implementation grant that GPE gives out. We do not support activities which are outside the domain of the government and the planning that the government does. So that's my response on the first question. The second question, would you repeat again, Victoria? I'm not too sure if I follow it very well.
What is the position of GPE on the development of inclusive education through non-special schools, or the development of specialised schools which fall under the ministry?
Okay. I think GPE's position is very clear on that. The general comment, the CRPD's general comment on inclusive education clearly outlines what the vision of inclusive education should be, and which direction that countries need to take on that particular front. GPE's vision is aligned with the CRPD's vision, and specifically with the general comment on inclusive education for children with disabilities. But having said that, like I said in the presentation, we did find during our review that all countries, different countries, are at different stages of interpreting and understanding what inclusive education means within their context and within the mechanisms that are available. But we also recognize that there is a huge capacity building that needs to be done for countries to be able to better collect data on disability, as well as do better sector analysis, which is then going to help develop informed sector plans. So I think that's how we look at the issue on education for children with disabilities. And I hope I've answered the question.
There's also another question as well. There are another two questions from Jean-Marie Vianney. The first question from Madame Vianney is there support for inclusive schools for deaf children in secondary schools and universities? She feels as though in the presentation a lot of the support provided seems to be for inclusiveness in the primary cycle. That's why she's asking that question. And she just gives an example of how some schools that she's familiar with in Côte d'Ivoire have a single school specialised in the primary cycle that provides assistance for deaf children in those contexts.
I think that your question is very, very country specific and very contextual, but I can inform you that GPE works with primary education and lower secondary education. That's our target. So that's why probably you felt that the presentation was more geared towards analysis of services or planned services for primary education and not secondary school for the deaf. I would have to say that I am not very well informed about the status of or the progress in secondary education in Côte d'Ivoire, specifically for providing more support to students with disabilities in secondary schooling. So I do apologize for the lack of my knowledge in that particular area.
And there is, I don't know perhaps whether you've addressed it already, there's a comment, somewhat of a question from Paula Frederica Hunt. Mm-hmm. You've answered it already.
I
about
think
the use of terminology.
Connie did that.
Oh, okay.
And the thing about the terminology, I think Connie did kind of mention that, but point well taken.
And there is a comment that it's important to develop the curriculum to be inclusive, to ensure that learning outcomes are scaffolded, learning outcomes are scaffolded to show how learners will achieve learning outcomes progressively.
Kindly come closer to the mic. We really have a difficulty to hearing you.
Sorry, I was just reading out a comment that one of the participants online highlighted the importance of developing the curriculum to be inclusive, but it needs to ensure that learning outcomes are scaffolded and that there is evidence to show that learners are actually achieving learning outcomes progressively.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and I think. And it's like, I think this is one of the areas where more discussion needs to happen in terms of really how do we align learning outcomes for all learners, and also within the national assessment frameworks. We know that a lot of countries are really kind of gearing towards measuring learning through nationalized assessments, which and it's children with disabilities never participate in those nationalized assessments. So I think it's a very important area which needs to be unpacked to really see that how do we kind of not necessarily align with the current method, with the current assessment methods, but how do we kind of bring about a pedagogical shift which inclusive education asks for, to really kind of target learning for all children and each and every individual. So I think that's a great point. Thank you so much.
Those are all the questions.
All right. I think we've kind of come to an end of the webinar. Again, thank you so much for participating. I just wanted to close the session by saying that all the materials and all the slides and all the presentations which were done today will be shared both in English as well as French. And a summary of the discussion recorded as well as a written summary will be shared with all the participants who are there, as well as the ones who RSVP'd for this webinar. So thank you so much once again, and I think it's a wrap up from DC. Thank you, Team Comoros. Thank you, Team Kenya. I think we'll say goodbye here.
Thank you so very much. We really liked the webinar.
Thank you.